Hello, and welcome back to the Gardner Show.
The Gardner Show. The Gardner Show. The Gardner Show. The Gardner Show. The Gardner Show. The Gardner Show. The Gardner Show. The Gardner Show. The Gardner Show.
I'm your host, M. Gardner. I'm a novelist, a lifelong lover of stories, and whether you're new here or you've been with me since the beginning, welcome back to my campfire. Behind every great story is a deeper question. Today, we're going to start with one. It's simple on the surface, but the more it sits with you, the bigger it gets. Here it is. What drives you to write? So pull up a chair, and let's begin at the very beginning. A quick note before we dive in. A lot of today's episode is going to reference my own life's work and my own life. So, if you're a fan of mine, just be aware that there might be spoilers. And I would like to thank you genuinely for being here. I appreciate it more than you'll ever know. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. I want to take you back to late 2017. On the surface, things looked like they were going well. I was in school for ASL education. I had what felt at the time like my first successful relationship. I was happy. And then I was diagnosed with a mental illness. Bipolar type 1 with schizoaffective tendencies. That diagnosis started to affect me, and not necessarily in the way you'd expect. I got emotional, unstable, and I started experimenting with drugs. I want to be very clear, they were all prescribed to me by a doctor. I had been put on antipsychotic medication for the schizoaffective tendencies, and the way it interacted with me and where I was mentally at the time was not good. It was an awful stretch of my life. I genuinely did not know where it was going to end up. School became too hard. The relationship became too hard. Everything came crashing down at once. But I survived. I'm here now. I lived, I got stable, and by 2001 I was doing well. And I'm happy to report, aside from the occasional manic episode, I'm still doing well. I'm telling you this not because it's a mental health episode, not because I'm telling you, but I am telling you because it's the actual honest origin point of why I write. And I don't think I can talk about what drives me to write without being honest about where that drive came from. What I'm about to describe is something called narrative medicine or narrative therapy. The idea that the act of writing about an experience and creating the story structure around chaos has genuine healing properties, and I can tell you from lived experience that it does. While all of this was happening, I was in therapy, and my therapist, of all people, suggested that I start a journal. Not a gratitude journal, that was never going to be my style. She suggested that I start writing a journal about the life I someday wanted to have. I knew exactly what she meant, and I did not want to follow it, at all. Not in a literal sense, at least. I did something else instead. Instead of journaling about the actual life I wanted, I started writing about the imagined life I wanted. And that imagination turned into stories of angels, demons, epic fights, worlds that had nothing to do with ASL classroom, or the perception or side effects, or anything I was actually living through. My therapist did what therapists do. She noticed what I was doing, and she did the right thing. She actually challenged me to write a book. Now, I don't go into anything half-cocked. So before I committed to that, I looked up statistics on what actually takes to write and publish a book. Now, I am not sharing these statistics to scare anyone off, because they are quite frightening. I am sharing them because if you've ever fought through the odds, or if you're in the middle of fighting through them right now, I want you to understand what kind of company that puts you in. The most commonly cited figure, going back to a survey from Jenkins Group, referenced by the critic Joseph Epstein, not that Epstein, is that somewhere around 80 to 81% of Americans say that they want to write a book some point in their life. That is a huge number. 80%. That is the vast majority of the country. But the number of people who actually finish the manuscripts is a tiny fraction. Estimates across surveys put it at anywhere from 3% of people to down under 1% of people of the general population. And that number goes down dramatically for those who have published a manuscript. Whether that is traditional, hybrid, self-published, it's smaller and smaller still, often cited under 1%. That means if you are a published author, you are in the 0% of Americans who want to write a book. So you start with 100 people who want to write a book. You might end up with 2, maybe one who actually publish something. That's terrifying. And that's also, I think, kind of beautiful, because it means that someone who finished the book and gets it out there for the world to see has done something genuinely rare. So if you are working on something right now, a manuscript, a script, or a story that you haven't shown anyone, I just want you to actually sit with that. Sit with that and think that you are already in rare company just for trying. Finish the thing. Come join the ranks. Be my brother. Here's something I want to say about the specifics of my situation that might resonate with some of you. When I was in a dark place, and if you've been in my situation, you know what that dark place is. And the depression and the medication and the complications and the relationship falling apart. And I felt like everything was spinning out of control, and I couldn't control my own brain chemistry, and I couldn't control how often other people could perceive me, and I couldn't control what was happening to my body or my relationships or my futures. I couldn't control anything. And then I wrote. When I opened a blank page, I started creating a world that I had absolute control of. The characters did what I told them to do. The storm happened when I needed it to happen. The plot point resolved exactly the way I designed it to resolve. The dragon died when I decided it died, and the hero survived when I decided they survived. That's not a small thing when your life feels like you're drowning. And God, it feels like you're drowning. Psychologists who study the narrative and trauma have documented this phenomenon. Researcher James Penbreaker conducted an extensive research showing that the act of writing about emotionally significant effects, particularly writing in which you are constructing narrative coherence out of chaotic experience, has a measurable positive effect on both psychological well-being and physical health. The people who benefit most weren't those simply venting about their experience. They were the ones who actually structured their experience into narrative, who made sense of what happened, organized it into a story with cause and effect and meaning. That's what I was doing. That's what I am doing. I am taking the chaos that is fragmenting my life and imposing story structure upon it. The difference is, in my imagined worlds, I win. In my stories, the heroes lived. In the narratives I was creating, there was meaning, and there was resolution, and there was agency. There is a concept in psychology called flow state, developed by research Manly Kiskazamtenmaharsiliki. I don't know how to pronounce it. I will post it somewhere. I don't know. Flow is what happens when you are completely absorbed in an activity and the sense of self falls away. You are challenged at exactly the right level, not so easy that you are bored and not so hard that you are anxious, but right at the edge where your full attention is required. Writers know this state well. It is when you are going to bed at 10 o'clock in the evening and you're gonna write 3 more words and you look at the clock and it's 5 o'clock in the morning. Those hours just melt away. Flow state is deeply rewarding neurologically. Your brain releases dopamine. You feel engaged. You feel alive. You feel purposeful. And here's the thing. Flow state is the flow cognitive state that appears to be naturally protective against depression and anxiety. So when I was at my lowest, when I was engaging in an activity that was writing, it was giving me, one, a sense of control and agency of the situation where I had none. Two, narrative coherence, making sense out of chaos. Three, regular access to flow state. That protects rewarding neurological state. A future-oriented purpose. I was writing towards something. Publication. That's a powerful cocktail. That's the reason I write. That goes much deeper than I want to be published. That brings me to the real question of this episode. What drove me to become one of those people who actually finishes? What keeps driving me now? I don't think it's the money. I don't think it's the need for publication or even the need for recognition. Though, to be honest, those things will be nice one day. I think what actually drives me to write is that I am looking for an answer. Why do stories matter? Why do they survive? What keeps us coming back to the same myth, the same writers, the same kind of stories, day after day, year after year, generation after generation? That's what drives me to write. It's not how much money can I make from this. It's why do people love the things they love, and how do I leave my mark on that? There is a concept in cognitive science called narrative transportation. That's when you are reading something really good. Something physically shifts in your brain. You're not just processing information, you're being transported. You're inhabiting the minds of the characters, living through their experiences, actually becoming something else, someone else for a while. That's not a metaphor. Brain imaging studies show that when you are narratively transported, multiple neural systems activate simultaneously. Not just the language processor, but motor cortex, sensory cortex, the regions that would activate if you were actually experiencing what that character was experiencing. You're not just reading about someone running. Your brain, in a sense, is running. That's the power we're dealing with. That's why stories matter. And that's what I want to understand. I want to be good enough at wielding this power to transport someone else the way I've been transported thousands of times. So let's actually sit with that question for a minute. Why do we like the stories we do? Why is the hero's journey the same pattern told thousands of times in thousands of different ways? Why is that so compelling to us? And I'm going to be a little bit bold here. And I'm going to say that I think it taps into something primal, a desire to be unique, a desire to be something more than what we are on average Tuesdays. We told stories about Hercules, we tell stories about Superman, and I argue we tell them because they speak directly to everyday person and their quiet desire to be strong, to matter, to be capable of something extraordinary. We tell these stories because the hero is not us. They are different, and the difference is the entire point. It is the fact that Clark Kent, a journalist, that's not the hook. That is not the hook. That's the part of the story we skip in our minds. The fact that he's fundamentally different from us in every other human being on the planet, and he still gets the girl. He's extraordinary, and he's somehow still relatable. That tension is the whole engine. Now, I want to say something a little more pointed at this point, and I want to frame it carefully because I think it gets to something real. I think this same dynamic is the part of what makes the story of Jesus so enduring and so widely embraced across cultures, even outside the explicitly religious context. I don't think it's because the story is entirely unprecedented. Scholars, comparative religion, have long noticed that the dying and rising God figures of divine miracle workers and humble-born servants appear across many ancient traditions, from Egypt myths to the various Greco-Roman hero cults. but the gospel narrative shares a structural DNA with the story that came before it, the way most enduring stories do. But I don't think that similarity is what makes it powerful. I think what makes it powerful is the same thing that makes any lasting story powerful. It's different enough, specific enough, human enough in its details. The carpenter's son, the betrayal of your best friend, the death and reported resurrection, the radical inversion of power where the most exalted figures choose humility and suffering, and that stands apart from everything that came before it, even while drawing from familiar mythic archetypture. It isn't separated from human storytelling instinctively. It is one of the most studied and influential examples of it, period. I want to be careful here because I'm not trying to make any theological claims, even though I will. Christ is King, praise Jesus. So I don't want to make any theological claims or why this story is true versus other ones. That's a different conversation, at deeply personal one for each listener. What I'm making is a storytelling observation. The patterns that make story resonate across thousands of years, across widely different cultures, is not really about the novelty. It's different enough inside a shape we already recognize and both feel familiar with and new at the same time. And that is exactly the needle I am trying to thread in my own work. My stories, they are not unique. My sister points that out to me occasionally, and she's not wrong. There are no premise that I have written that has not been written before. But I don't think that I need to be unique. I think I need to be different enough to be good. I want to talk about something that might seem obvious, but that I think deserves more attention. Different genres seem to appeal to different psychological drives. A thriller and a mystery is driven by the intellectual. It is trying to solve a puzzle. Your brain is engaged in patterns matchmaking, in thinking ahead and trying to outpace the author. Those satisfaction comes when you either guess correctly or when the author outthinks you. It's play at a cognitive level. Romance is driven by emotional and social. You are exploring the dynamics concerning vulnerability, the possibility of being truly known by another person. It's tapping into one of the most deepest human desires. The satisfaction comes from the emotional resolution, from the sense that those two people get one another. The horror, and this might sound perverse, is driven by often about control through confrontation. You're vulnerably entertaining a space where you are afraid, but you are doing it at your terms. You close the book, you can put it down, and that's control at your experience of fear. Something about your relationship with fear itself shifts. Epic fantasy. The drive-in is often mythic and spiritual. You're looking for meaning. You're looking for a story large enough to contain your sense of what matters. You're looking for a world with depths, with history, with the feeling that they existed before the story began and will continue after it ends. I think my own work appeals to different drives depending on the book, and I think that's probably true for most writers. Anrith, The Tale of a Bear and His Guns, I think appeals to something like a thriller drive. It's invested, instead of can the hero survive this world, it's can the hero survive one more person in one more moment by doing the right thing, even when it costs him everything. And about agency and moral clarity in a world that usually doesn't offer either. Gods, Aliens, and Onion Rings, that's more of a horror thriller hybrid. It's playing at the fear that confrontation, but also the spiritual seeking. It's asking what happens when things you've been trained to fight turns out to be something entirely different than you've thought. The Epic of El, that's a mythic fantasy drive. I wanted to write something that feels like it had history, depth, a sense of a world extended far beyond the narratives that it shows you. I think understanding which drive your story is appealing to, which psychological need is meeting, is actually really important to understand what it means to be a writer for that story. I want to pull back for a moment and look at other writers themselves and what they have said because I think it's introspective. Stephen King in his memoirs and writing describes himself, his drive to write as a compulsion. He says that writers become something writing is something he has to do because that not writing would create some kind of psychological pressure that demands release. He describes writing as an exploration, as finding out what he didn't know before he started. Ursula K. Le Guin said something different. She said she writes to explore ethical questions. She asks what if, what social structures about power, how humans relate to each other. She once was using fiction as a tool of a psychological inquiry. She wasn't writing to tell her story. She was writing to ask questions that couldn't be asked any other way. Maya Angelou wrote to bear witness. She said, "I've learned that people will forget what you said. People will forget what you did. People will never forget how you made them feel." She was writing to document human experience, to make sure that the experience of people who might otherwise be forgotten were preserved in a language. Those are different drives, and I think all of them are valid. For me, it's a combination. I am driven partially because of my compulsion, like Stephen King. There's something in me that needs to come out. I am driven partly by philosophical inquiry, like Le Guin. I am asking questions through my characters that I don't have answers to otherwise, and I am driven partly for wanting to document something true about the human experience, the way Angelou describes. But underneath all of those is something simpler. I write because stories are how we make meaning. They're how we process experience. They're how we figure out who we are and who we want to become. And I want to be a part of that process for myself, and if I'm lucky, for others. Writer's Corner. This week's Writer's Corner is really just a continuation of everything I've just said, because right now, this question, am I being driven by the right thing, is the exact thing I am wrestling with in my own works. I am not chasing originality for its own sake anymore. I used to think that this was the goal, to be the first person to ever tell this story. But nobody is the first person to tell any story. Not really. Every plot has an ancestor. So the question I keep coming back to in revision is, what's the small, specific human detail in this scene that makes it feel like mine, even though the shape of the story has existed for centuries? I am working on revisions for Anrith right now, and there's a scene where Bear has to confront someone he cares about, a hard truth on the surface. It's a scene I've seen 100 times, 2 characters, conflict resolution, basic. But what makes it mine is a small physical detail. It's the way Bear can't quite make eye contact. It's the way his hand moves. It's the specific fumbling of words that feels true to how he communicates, which is different from how other characters communicate. That comes from my life. I'm anthropomorphizing myself into Bear because it's safer to explore certain emotions through a character than through direct self-examination. But the specific of how he moves through the world comes directly from my own patterns, my own wounds, and my own way of being. Sometimes it's a piece of dialogue. Sometimes it's a strange physical detail about the character. Sometimes it's just the particular way a character fails instead of succeeding in that moment where every other version of this story would have them succeed. I've also been thinking a lot about what drive each of my projects come from, and I think that it's actually clarifying my revision process. Anrith, I'm driven by the question, what does it mean to keep choosing to help people even when they're not special, even when they're not a hero, even when you're just a guy with a gun who happens to be in the right place at the right time. In God's Aliens and Onion Rings, I'm driven by the question, what happens when your entire identity is built on a role, and that role turns out to be based on a lie? Epic of L, I'm driven by the question, what does it feel like to be the most powerful person in the world and still be profoundly limited by the world itself? Those questions drive, and those are the questions I'm asking. And everything else is plot, character, setting, serves those questions. The challenge for you this week, if you're working on something, stop thinking about whether the story is original. It's not. Nothing is. Instead, ask yourself, what is the question I'm actually trying to ask through this story? What am I genuinely curious about? Write that question down, make it explicit, and then ask, is this scene serving that question? Is every question a choice pointing towards exploration, or is it exploring that question more deeply? If not, you might have scenes that are well written, but don't belong in your story because they're not serving your drive. Cut them, let them go. Keep only what serves your question you're actually asking. That's where the drive becomes the craft. Here's where I land with this one. I don't want to be the best. I don't need millions of readers, although I admit that would be really nice. What I actually want is to be good enough at telling a story, good enough at keeping you captive for 20 minutes at a time, good enough that you pull up a chair and come next week. That's it. That's my whole ambition, stripped down to its actual size. And that's the actual truth for most of us who write. If you were honest with yourself, not trying to write the next world-defining myth, most of us are just trying to be different enough, true enough, specific enough to be good. We're trying to ask the questions that matter to us and see if we can get down on the page in the way that lets others feel the same way we feel when we ask it. That's the thing that drives us. The thing that drives you to write might be the personal catharsis. It might be intellectual puzzle solving. It might be spiritual seeking. It might be the need to document something true about the human experience. Whatever it is, I implore you, honor it. Because that drive, that thing that makes you open the blank page day after day, even when the odds are terrible and the outcome is uncertain, that's the rarest and most valuable thing a writer has. Stories are everywhere, and now that you know a little more about what they're doing and what actually driven a person to write on the other side of the page, you'll start to see them differently. And maybe you're sitting with a story of your own right now, something you've been afraid to finish or afraid to show anyone. Maybe you understand that the drive that brought you to that story is exactly the drive that you need to finish it. Thanks for pulling up a chair around my campfire. Keep questioning, keep telling stories, and keep creating. And I'll see you next time on the Gardner Show.